Hello everybody, I am Gaëtan Klein. I am a certified therapist from the Institute for the Study of Peak States. And in today's video we are going to discuss generational traumas and the basics of epigenetic and how we carry our ancestors' emotional burden and how we can access and heal these traumas. So we are going to discuss what is going on at the genetic level and especially at what we call the epigenetic level, a new branch of biology which explains how the genes behave. And everybody would agree that what is going on at the genes level is very important for our health, our well-being, our biology. But what is going on at the epigenetic level is also extremely important because, as you will see, it will allow our genes to work or not. So let's go into it. So our genes determine our biology, our metabolism, our eye color, how our organs function, and everything that we can do biologically speaking. And genes are heavily influenced by molecules that are wrapped around them that we call histones. And we call the behavior of the histones epigenetic. Epi means what's around, so epigenetic, what is around the genes, right? But unfortunately, histones can be damaged, and when there is a damaged histone, it prevents the genes from expressing itself. And then we lose the abilities that the genes confers normally. So if we take a closer look at the genes, you can see here from the chromosome, you have this DNA string, and within it are written the genes. But if you take a closer look, you can see that the genes are wrapped around these blue buns, which are actually the histones. And when we need a gene, when we need to use it, what is supposed to happen is the histones are supposed to open themselves so that the gene can be accessible and used. But when the histones are in this configuration, the gene is not accessible, so it's inactive, we cannot use it. And this is supposed to happen frequently and smoothly. But unfortunately, if the histones are damaged, they will stay stuck and they are not going to unwrap themselves and open themselves. And so unfortunately, the gene is going to remain inaccessible. And this is a big problem because if we have genes but we cannot use them, we can do what we are supposed to do biologically speaking. So you can see that there are different mechanisms that create epigenetic problems, and the main one are developmental issues. And also the environment is very important, the diet, aging, all those factors are important. But what is the most important of all is this developmental category. And we call this problem epigenetic damage. So the gene expression is inhibited, which means it's blocked, by the damaged histone. Now, I have a bad news for you, and the bad news is that traumas are the main source of epigenetic damage. So when we have stress, when something bad happened to us, that creates some damage at the genes level, at the epigenetic level. And the second bad news of today is that these traumas, this stress, are transmitted from one generation to the other. So we inherit the stress and the traumas from our ancestors. So if you think about it, these traumatic events that our ancestors lived impact us. If they go through bad times, we can have a memory of this. So their life conditions, their successes and their ordeals will partly determine our own life experience. So emotions, stress, and traumas are imprinted deep, at the deepest level of our biology, at the genetic level. So if you think about yourself, half of your genes come from your father and your mother, right? So if those genes are carrying with them some epigenetic damages, then you will have 50% of the damages from your father and 50% from your mother. And it's the same with us from the other generation, from your grandparents. Your mother will carry half of the traumas and the stresses that is embedded in your grandparents' genetic material. So this is transmitted from one generation to the other, and if you have children, 50% of the genes are coming from you, obviously, so 50% of your own stresses and your own difficulties will be transmitted to them. Now, that raises the question, why do some people have some issues and some people do not have? Like people that I chose here, they seem to be very happy and they are not afraid of, the void and the hate behind them. But some people would be really afraid of being, they have vertigo and they're really afraid of hate. So what makes the difference between people who experience some difficulties and some people who don't? Some children are very afraid of storms and some are not. Some people are more sensitive to depression or addiction or to other issues. So how does this happen? Why is it that some people have this personality and some people don't have these same problems? Why is not everybody afraid of hate, right? Well, the traumas of our ancestors predisposes us to the potential traumas of our own life, which means our own difficulties are predetermined, we are pre-sensitized to traumatic events if our ancestors have been going through similar events. So what our ancestors pass on to us is going to create difficulties for us. So this is how it happens. When you're in a new situation or challenging situation, first, your body and your mind is going to go to your resources reservoir, which is the genes, right, at the biological level. And then, because the genes' access is conditioned by what is around them, so epigenetic level, so there is going to be a filter, and it's as if we are asking our ancestors, can I do this or not? How do I do this? So at the epigenetic level, if this is okay, if this is fine, then this will be transmitted and we have a positive, well-adapted reaction to the situation. So everything is going fine. And it really feels like what is going on at the biological level is also happening at the psychological level. So I'm using this metaphor like we are almost asking our ancestors, how do I react in this new situation? And if the information that we have is fear, for example, then we will feel that fear in this situation. And so either we will be afraid or we'll try to run away and escape the situation. Anyway, we will have an inadapted reaction because we don't have the resources that we should have as a genetic level. So how is this real and how can you experience it? So we're going to do a short exercise which I called leaning on your ancestors. So this is pretty simple, and the goal of this is to make you feel that you have access to this epigenetic damage when there is a problem or opening when your gene can be expressed. So think about a challenging situation for you. It can be a situation at your work or in your relationships or something that you struggle with. Just a challenging situation. And imagine that you go in this situation mentally. You put yourself into that situation. And then imagine that you're leaning backward on your grandparents, right? So do this one grandparent at a time. So for example, choose your maternal grandmother and imagine that you're leaning on her in this situation. And then you can feel if this is solid behind you and if you feel like there is a support, like, seems like it's pretty solid and it's going fine. That means that there is no problem at this level. So if you feel this is solid, it means you have access to the necessary resources to handle the situation positively. Now, you can try it on your 4 grandparents and you can pause this video if you need to, so you can practice and test with all your 4 grandparents. So your maternal grandmother, your maternal grandfather, your paternal grandmother and grandfather, and each time you lean backward on them and you can feel what's going on. And if you feel like you are going to fall backward, like, oh, there is a void, there is no support there, that means that it's very likely that there is what we call a generational trauma. And you might actually be able to feel it as a negative emotion or negative belief sometimes. So if you feel like, ooh, there is no support and I'm going to fall backward, you can try to sense what is the emotion that you feel behind you. And this is probably the same emotion that you feel in this situation that is changing. And this is actually probably why the situation is challenging to you. So you can use this exercise to know if you are supported by your genes in a given situation, or if there is an epigenetic damage, an epigenetic problem that you need to correct. So pause this video and finish this exercise to feel what's going on. So this is really a kinesthetic, a sensory experience. And that should prove to you that you do have access to this, it's within you, it's there. And generational traumas, unfortunately, are the root cause of many and many psychological problems. You might have never heard about it actually, but everything that is in the realm of negative emotions, limiting beliefs, or being pre-sensitized in a traumatic event, that means if you look at it, if you take many people that go through the same traumatic event, for example, an accident or something happens, some people will be traumatized and some people will not. Some people will have a hard time to recover from this event, and some people will just shrug it and be fine. And there is a variety of response between those three extremes, of course. And this is why in a traumatic event, a part of the people will have PTSD and some people will be fine. This is because of generational traumas. And they also have a big impact on our immunity and our health, our physical health. So some diseases and some immunity problems might be due or influenced by generational traumas. And also, it expands into a whole life situation. So if you have a negative life situation, what I call negative life orientation, then it might be because there is an influence of the generational events of your ancestors. So, what are the implications of this? How can we apply it? Well, first, we can study what has been going on in our grandparents and our ancestors' lives, which we call psychogenealogy. So, understanding the life of our ancestors will enlighten you about understanding your own life. So, if you have challenges in your life, if you're wondering, what is my path? What should I do? And why am I reacting the way I'm reacting in this situation? And am I freely choosing the life I want to live? Or is there something else that's influencing me? So you can analyze the life of your parents, your grandparents, their parents, and so on. And if you look at their life, the life path, so to speak, or what happened to them throughout their life, you will start to notice some patterns. Some things are similar from different members of your family. And there is some global life schemes that can be really the same. And also, what can happen is that some of the struggles of your grandparents are really something that you want to avoid at all costs. And unconsciously, you've been avoiding the same situations as they've been through. Why? Because you inherited the traumas. And so a part of you knows that if you go into these situations, you will have trouble, right? So this is a very efficient, in some way, survival mechanism. We pass on our experience to our descendants, to our offspring. So we also have the information of our ancestors of what is the right way to do things and what is dangerous. But this is also a limit, because our life circumstances are not the same than our grandparents or ancestors, but we still carry on the same reactions because of these generational traumas. So sometimes they are useful, but actually most of the time they are not so useful, as they are limiting us and they are creating negative reaction in situations where we want to grow and improve. So you can analyze all this with psychogenealogy. This also helps to understand cultural patterns. So it's also referred in the literature as collective or cultural traumas. For example, the cultural background of your ancestors also has a meaning and an influence on your life. We'll talk more about this later on. So, for example, you can ask yourself, is the same issue often present in the family? And for example, if you are working with somebody who has depression, let's say, you must start to notice, oh, actually my mother had depression, and my uncle had depression, and my grandfather had depression, and I have some cousins that also have depression. So if the same issue, if the same problem is present in different members of the family, well, that's very likely that there is at least a component of this problem that is generational traumas, right? So you can ask yourself, what is my family going through? What are the similarities in terms of struggles and in terms of also capacities? And the same problem, is it common within the cultural group you are from? So if you think about it, the life circumstances is heavily influenced by the environment, right? Especially the more you go backward in time, the more this is true. Like our life is very different from the life people lived 100 years ago or 300 years ago. And you can also analyze your own difficulties. For example, if you have emotions or problems that you have no idea where they're coming from, they might be coming from this. For example, the Jewish people in Europe have a heavy cultural trauma, right? They have been going through very difficult times the last century. So if you are a descendant from European Jewish, you might carry with you some fears, some insecurities that might be related to what happened to your ancestors. And you can analyze what is your cultural background and does it have an influence on you? And sometimes the roots of some problems are from what happened 100 years ago, actually, right? And also, there are some cultural patterns that keep repeating themselves. For example, there is a study, I recently read a study on Native American Indians, and the study was showing that very often they were having struggled with finding their place and being rejected and being moved away from the place they lived in. And their land was taken from them. And they're replaying the traumas that they lived 200 years ago, right? And if you look at different countries and different cultural groups, you can kind of analyze the psychology of that group, and you can see that it reflects on us and it impacts us, right? So if you have difficulties, that might be coming from this. So the consequence of these traumas being passed on from one generation to another is that the same traumas have the tendency to repeat themselves in the lives of the offspring. So we have a tendency to repeat the same traumas that our ancestors had, which is counterintuitive because you would think that they transmitted the traumas to us to warn us and to make us able to not go into difficult situations. But what is actually going on is that we replay those traumas. And so very often, the difficulties of our life are the same difficulties that our ancestors had, or it's a mix of them because we inherit part of their traumas at each generation, right? So that raises the question, which proportion of our lives is conditioned by these generational traumas? And are we really free? And how can we become more free, right? So back to the application, there is a third one, which is, of course, obviously, psychotherapy. So we can, with this understanding, we can create deeper and more efficient treatments. And also, this has a big application in medicine where we can use it to create new treatments to cure and to prevent different issues based on this epigenetic understanding of this biology. So let's talk about the treatment. So the first step of the treatment is knowing how to access these generational traumas, and which are the same thing as epigenetic damages, and knowing how to heal them efficiently. I'm using the word heal, but you can use the word treat or correct or change, right? It's the same thing. And then we can create therapeutic techniques, or what is also called epigenetic intervention. And this is really a big promise, because that means that psychological techniques might have an influence on the biology. So something that seems to be in our mind is actually going to have an impact on our body, right? And then knowing how to target those that are relevant to our specific problems. And for this, we need an investigation method. And at the Institute for the Study of Peak States, we have our own method, which we call subcellular psychobiology. So we study what's going on at the intracellular level, and we study the link between the biology and the psychology at this level. So, knowing how to access those generational traumas. Well, if you look at the biology of these traumas, we actually discovered the biology of traumas. And this is pretty simple to show. So imagine that we are within a cell, and this is what we call a messenger RNA string. And here we are inside the nuclear core of the cell, and at the center there is a DNA. So when we need a gene to be expressed, our DNA is supposed to create this messenger RNA string, and it's supposed to come out from this pore and to be read by these big molecules, which we call ribosomes. And then the ribosomes will create some proteins, and this thing is supposed to dissolve, disappear. And we can use the protein, which is kind of a biological ability at this level. But when there is a trauma, unfortunately, this part here, which is the histone, is damaged. And because this is damaged, the messenger RNA is going to be stuck. And because it is stuck, each time we need it, the ribosome that comes in to read it is going to remain stuck also. And we're going to have this pile, this stack of stuck ribosomes, and everything is stuck, and we cannot use the information. The ribosomes are not going to make the proteins that they should make, and we cannot use information from the gene. So this is bad news. This is a blocked biological ability. And we've discovered that traumas are actually stored within these subcellular structures, which are called ribosomes. And this drawing is from our book, Subcellular Psychobiology by Grant McFettridge. And how does it tie biology and psychology together? Well, we discovered that within these ribosomes, the memories of what happened to us, these traumatic memories, they are stored in these ribosomes. And because this is the case, we have what we call trauma stack, when if there has been a trauma at some level, in the future, when we go into a similar situation, we will have another trauma. And every time we go into this kind of situation, every time we need a gene, we will actually experience a trauma. That's because we cannot react to the situation. It can be overwhelming, it can be damaging, and we experience trauma. And the more we experience trauma, the more ribosomes adds up, and this is becoming worse and worse. So when you have a trauma, when you experience a trauma in your adult life, that is because you have had traumas before that, and they all have the same emotion. So each ribosome embeds a traumatic memory. Now, this is what we call a biographical trauma, because the experiences that are stored within those ribosomes are from our own life. So they are biographical events, right? So for example, if you have an argument with your spouse and you feel afraid inside of yourself, this might remind you of when you were feeling alone when you were a kid and you were afraid and without resources. And we can track them to prenatal biological developmental events. Now, at the same level within the cell, there also are these generational traumas. And they look a little bit differently from biographical traumas. Instead of ribosomes, what we have here is some structures that look like pearls and discs. So generational traumas are the same place within the cell, they just have a different shape. and the underlying mechanism is the same. You also have a damaged histone and an epigenetic damage. So all of these traumas, biographical and generational, are inhibiting our correct genetic expression. So how do you access these generational traumas? Well, as we've seen before, we can access them with our feelings and our mind, because our mind is linked to our biology at this very intimate level. So earlier, when I asked you to lean backward on your grandparents and feel if they support you or if you fall backward, that's a way to access those epigenetic damages. Another way to do it is to visualize each of your grandparents and to ask yourself, are they going through the same struggles than I do? Do they have the same emotion or the same problems that I have? And you might be able to sense, oh yes, it seems like my maternal grandmother has this issue. And that means that there is a generational trauma, right? And it's important when you use this technique to think about your grandparents and not your parents or their parents, because this is the easiest way to access our ancestor lines. The grandparent level has something pretty special to it that allows us to access it. So if you suspect that there is a generational trauma, don't try to look at it in your parents. That will not be working so well. Instead, look within your grandparents, and you might be able to find it pretty easily. So then the question is how to heal them efficiently. Now I'm not going to go in details on how to do it, because this is something that you should do with a professional. But if you already know, or if you already use some therapeutic techniques, you might apply this knowledge right away. So for example, EFT and TAT, which are meridian techniques, that are in the category of body-mind psychotherapy, both these techniques are efficient on generational traumas. So if you know to use them, you can use them in this fashion. And probably other meridian therapies could be also efficient. Now, we're not sure if other therapies such as EMDR, which is a very well-known therapy for trauma, or hypnosis are efficient. I'm not aware of anybody who's been using them this way, but it's worth trying. And if you know some professionals that use EMDR and for generational trauma, that's wonderful. And probably hypnosis could also work in some way. But I would not rely on these techniques. Actually, I would prefer EFT, for example, or TAT. And of course, our own peak state therapy is both very efficient, very accurate, very fast, and easy to practice on generational traumas. Actually, we designed the technique especially based on this understanding, so this is really efficient. And as you can imagine from everything we went through today, this opens the doors for a brand new way of doing therapy, right? Because most problems encountered in therapy are actually directly or indirectly caused by generational traumas. And these unconscious repressed traumas can really ruin our life. So knowing how to efficiently treat biographical and generational traumas is enough, in our experience, to treat around 70% of cases in psychotherapy. And that's because in 70% of cases, there is a direct link between the presenting issue and the generational trauma. And in the remaining 30% of cases, the link is indirect or hidden, and so it requires an investigation method, and we call it subcellular psychobiology. So what are the advantages in therapy? Well, with the wrong technique, and if you are a therapist or if you have been doing therapy for yourself, you know that treating a trauma is very often long and hard to treat. And actually many people still believe today that it's impossible to treat, which is wrong. But if you have the wrong technique, of course you cannot do anything. Now with an efficient technique, a biographical trauma is very often treatable within 1 to 10 sessions. And this is very typical for EMDR or EFT or other body-mind techniques or many other trauma healing therapies. Now, if we work on the generational traumas, it's actually faster and easier. And with our technique, one generational trauma is very often treated within 2 to 10 minutes. That's really fast. And that means that when we're working on an issue, we might have to do it on several generational traumas because we might have several ancestral lines that are participating as a problem, right? But this is still very fast. And with this technique, a biographical trauma is very often treated within 10 to 14 minutes. So within one session, we can treat some very severe trauma if we use this technique. And also, generally speaking, healing a biographical trauma is difficult. It's really hard. If you have to relive the trauma again, for many people this is just too hard because the emotion is intense, the physical sensations are intense, and you have to face the hardship of the trauma. And the good news is that treating generational traumas is easier and faster. So this is a very good way to indirectly heal biographical traumas. So 90% of the time, actually healing generational traumas will eliminate the biographical trauma altogether. And that's because biographical traumas are built upon generational traumas. So if you have a biographical trauma, that's because you have these generational traumas in the backyard, so to speak, that are creating, influencing, amplifying this trauma of yours. So healing generational traumas will reduce the charge of the biographical trauma, so it will become much, much easier to face and heal. And sometimes it just completely disappears altogether. So for example, if you imagine that each color represents a trauma, and this is a biographical trauma, and these ones are generational traumas, instead of facing the whole stack, which is hard, it's easier to eliminate the first one, which is a generational trauma, and then the intensity of the whole problem decreases. And then you treat another generational trauma, another one, and at the end, the remaining part, which is a biographical, can be really, really small and much easier to treat. So this makes it so much easier to treat severe traumas, including post-traumatic stress disorders or other kind of severe traumas such as abuse, accidents, and so on. And again, this is a brand new way of doing therapy, right? So most of the time, working on biographical traumas can be avoided. And working on the generational level will be more profound, easier, and also very efficient. And moreover, there is also a fundamental difference between biographical traumas and generational traumas. So biographical traumas feel like something bad happened to you, something impacted my life. So of course, this is bad. This can create problems later on in life because you keep that traumatic memory within you. So you will replay the same emotion, the same issue. But there is a more fundamental layer because at the generational level, we feel like this is becoming us. And so what you would say is not something bad happened to me. You would feel I am fundamentally flawed. I have this issue. It's almost like I am this issue. So this is a deeper layer, of course. And that's why working on the generational level is very satisfying and efficient. So most of the time it also eliminates the biographical trauma altogether. So this is a very smart way of doing therapy, right? So if you are seeking healing, then what you can do is work with a professional who knows how to work on generational traumas. And if you are a therapist and you've never heard about this, well, you can get trained in our institute and it will teach you how to do this and how to heal generational traumas. So we regularly hold big state trainings. So if you've been interested in this video on epigenetic and generational level, we only scratch the surface, even though some of the principles and the ideas today might be already pretty groundbreaking for you and pretty new. And this is normal. There's not a lot of people who talk about this stuff, but this stuff is real, this stuff is in us, and we can use it or we can be the victims of it. But with the right technique, we can really change and be more free, more happy, and heal very disabling issues. So if you've been interested in this, you should also watch the next video, which will go at an even deeper layer, and we are going to discuss core traumas and core fundamental beliefs. Thank you for watching, and if you have any question, feel free to send me a comment. Thank you.